podcast role. Welcome in.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. We are glad that you are here. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, Peter. You ready to talk about Paul Freeman?
I am ready to talk about Paul Freeman. Actually, I say I'm ready. First, I just want to complain about the fact that, like so many Americans out there, I just got my health benefit. I participated in the Affordable Care Act. I'm in the marketplace, and I have a family of 5, and my insurance is going to go up. It's going to be twice as much a month. And I today have been like, what on earth? So that's where my brain is at the moment. So I do want to talk about Paul Freeman, and I'm excited to talk about all the work that he does around the Portrait of a Graduate, his absolute commitment to DEI, and then, he really does practice vulnerability. So while I sound really upbeat, I'm going to try to practice vulnerability too and be like, what the beep? What's going on? This is crazy. So
can I make a direct connection to Paul Freeman to your
my
your
sort of freak out?
Your opening freak out about the Affordable Care Act? Thank God, my wife works in healthcare.
Yeah, so that you have coverage. I mean, I felt that way when I left the superintendency. My wife was still an employee of a university that had good healthcare. And so for 2 years we had that. And then when she transitioned to be an independent scholar and I moved more into the consulting work, I was thrilled to be able to participate in Obamacare and have access to great healthcare, though I pay for it. Fine. I just shocked by the fact that it's right now based on inaction and an inability to lead for the people. Right now, I'm expecting to pay twice as much starting in January. And so I'm just kind of shocked by it.
I wrote a question about Paul, specifically as it relates to becoming a global citizen, the last tenet of their Portrait of a Graduate. The question I wrote was, empathy requires intention. So how do you empathize? And he said, how do you do that if you don't talk about topics that require students to empathize with people unlike themselves? If you don't talk about the conversations that are happening at a global level to other people.
This is a great example, quite frankly.
Exactly.
It's a great example.
Why do you think I'm bringing it up?
No, of course. No, I think it's a great example to empathize with those who are about to be radically impacted by the fact that we live in a country that doesn't have universal health care. And a few years ago, this is now 5 years ago. Wow, 5 years ago. So much time has passed. I was in Arkansas and was talking to a gentleman, and we were spending a couple of days together. And he said, oh, hold on a second. I got to take this call. I've been waiting for this call. And he's on the phone and he's saying, okay, so we have an appointment? Great. Oh my God, we're thrilled. Our daughter hasn't seen a dentist in 2 years, and I can't tell you how happy we are because she's been in pain and we haven't known what to do about it. So he hangs up the phone and then he reveals his politics to me, for which, to each his own. And he says, he's like railing against the previous administration at that point. So, he's railing against Obama's administration. And then I said, wait, that call you just had. Yeah. You are now participating in the marketplace for healthcare. Yeah. I mean, we couldn't get insurance before now, but now we've got it and it's great. I'm like, that's Obamacare. Like, we can totally disagree about so many different things, but this is something that is a legacy legislation that got your daughter the dental care that she's going to need. It got me now the kind of health care that I needed for my family instead of using a clinic or an emergency room as our primary care physician. And so, yeah, leaning into those difficult conversations.
How do you do with that?
I'm sure we're going to lose some of our I'm really thrilled that we went up 41% in our listeners since this season began. So thrilled. And pretty funny that, Singapore and Australia have been sort of like a growing audience for us. So for those in Singapore and Australia, they may be going, we've got universal healthcare, so I'm not sure what your issue is. I would say
come
it
on
is
over.
about leaning into those conversations. Yeah.
How did he do? You did that. You made that observation for him there in Arkansas. How did he do with it?
Yeah, he just went, huh. It was more like, huh. And we were not in a place where we were talking politics, nor did I want to engage, and nor did he. And so that was fine. Although, I felt probably smug at the moment. And so all I would say is they are important conversations, and it does start with empathy. And I love the fact that we would encourage children to engage in that kind of empathetic conversation as part of their course of study to say, you're ready for life.
To be empathetic requires intention. Intention means disciplined practice. You have to, in fact, there's a study that shows that to improve your empathetic response, you can by simply saying, I need to be more empathetic in this moment. You say that aloud.
Yes.
It helps your brain be more empathetic.
Yes.
So imagine if we are teaching that, even just that low level skill, imagine the skills that we could teach otherwise to kids coming up and how empathetic they could be toward one another. Wow. Would we have the kind of divides that we have in the U.S. now?
Totally agree. And my own research on empathy is we as humans can empathize and can do it well. We have to be invited to do so.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
To your point, like you have to be encouraged to practice it. So, all right, look, this is a great conversation that you and I are having. I want everyone to hear Paul Freeman. Let's get into that conversation. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Amonson.
We will see you on the other side. Today on An Imperfect Leader, we are joined by Dr. Paul Freeman. He's the superintendent in Guilford Public Schools in Connecticut. And with nearly 30 years of experience in Connecticut education, Paul, a former English teacher and a current professor of practice at UConn's Nehag School of Education, was also named Connecticut's Superintendent of the Year. Paul, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Peter, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm really excited. So nice to see you again. And in my conversations with leaders all across the nation, I've been really interested in their expanding definition of the skills and the characteristics that they expect from graduating students. And some call it market value assets. They do that in the Midwest. Guilford Public Schools adopted a portrait of a graduate model. And if I remember correctly, it's focusing on, and I wrote it down, so adaptable learner, responsible collaborator, effective communicator, critical thinker, empathic individual, which that's fantastic, and then global citizen. And so I wonder, would you talk a little bit about the specific, whether it's, I caution superintendents to talk about initiatives or programs, because then that just says I'm just window dressing certain things. But do you mind talking a little bit about the ways that you're doing that? How do you develop those attributes for your students?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. And so the portrait for us was really important work. The concepts, the ideas, the skills that are named in there, right? The dispositions. It's important for us that they cut across subject area and grade level. Kindergarten teachers can work together and talk about how they move their students towards these measures, and the AP science teachers can have that same conversation. What has grown out of the portrait for us when we say, how do we build these skills and these dispositions? We've also moved into really intentionally and really overtly working on our shared understanding of high quality instruction in the Guilford Public Schools. And again, it is a model that cuts across discipline and subject area. So for us, if we're going to move our students in that direction, rather than simply looking at reading scores, math scores, which we do, right? But when we look at those bigger skills, how do we do that? We do that by looking at an instructional paradigm that really centers visible learner thinking. And all of those words are really important for us, right? We want our kids thinking. And I've spent a career trying to figure out the difference between compliance and engagement. And now I really how do we know the students are actually thinking? And so how do you make that thinking visible? What are the teacher moves that you can employ that let you see inside the head and behind the eyes for a moment in time and get a sense that they really are grappling? We've moved into professional learning at the classroom level that really centers on what teacher moves, what task design, and what instructional strategies are going to help us to center that visible learner thinking in everything that we do.
So really, I mean, what I hear you saying is, so how do we sort of shift to allow teachers to be that activator of knowledge as opposed to just being the repository of all information that they just give to kids? How do they start doing that heavy lifting themselves? It sounds so much aligned to Ron Berger's book, An Ethic of Excellence, if you're familiar with his work at all. Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
And hand in hand with that, it requires then putting in front of the students topics, content, discussions that are worthy, right? Nobody is going to think deeply and really struggle with a concept if it's not a deep, rich, valuable, worthy concept. And so I give a ton of credit to the Guilford Board of Education, who just a few years ago recommitted to our policy around controversial topics in the classrooms. We especially as we get to the higher grade levels, we can't dance around talking about difficult and challenging topics in the classroom. The idea that you can encourage students to learn deeply without ever discomforting anybody is really troublesome to me. Like that just,
Right.
nobody learns a new skill without wrestling with it. To be a deep critical thinker without something worthy of deep critical thinking in front of them. And so for this Board of Education to, at that level, recommit to that, yes, we are going to talk about controversial topics in the classroom, and we will do it thoughtfully and respectfully and carefully, but we're going to do it, and to encourage teachers to move in that direction really then fits neatly with the pedagogical and the lesson design that we ask our teachers to really sort of wrestle with.
Well, now, I certainly, so my next question is absolutely aligned to that. So I appreciate you braiding that, my first one around the skills that you want all graduates to have, and then certainly thinking about, okay, so then how does a Board of Education and a community help us do that and create that cultural field to allow you to lead and your teachers to really create and curate coursework, and also, I guess, leverage students' own sort of interests, their own sort of what ifs or why certain things are happening within their own communities or globally. So if you're just joining us on An Imperfect Leader, our guest today is Dr. Paul Freeman, Superintendent of the Guilford Public Schools in Guilford, Connecticut. And I want to explore this a little bit around race and those topics that sometimes school districts will sort of run from. So in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this dimension called collective aspiration. And it's really like the heart of the work that any leader or any school district or system engages in. And in that dimension, there's these two terms, moral focus and compelling purpose, essentially asking the question, what do we want to create together? And also having a shared image of what does success look like? And Guilford Public Schools, you really, I get to talk to people every week, and so often, even offline, people will say, if we could steer away from some of the issues that are impacting schools right now, I'd appreciate it. And I go, okay. However, like your district really has taken meaningful steps to address the kind of experience that it wants for children. And it's engaged in social justice conversations, curriculum audits, staff learning opportunities. I did a whole deep dive into the witness stones. I didn't know what that project was. And then to see how, not just that you sort of participated, but meaningfully engaged in, and for those who are listening, it's really about the history of slavery in New England. And so,
hyperlocal in Guilford. It's really
right.
hyper.
If you go to their website and you look at the map, Guilford is on the map. And so in a time where conversations about race can feel particularly fraught, what has really driven your district's commitment to that work?
In the Portrait of the Graduate, we call out that we want our students to be empathetic individuals and global citizens. How do you do that if you don't talk about topics that require students to empathize with people unlike themselves, right? If you don't talk about the conversations that are happening at a global level. And again, right, when the Board of Education recognizes that import and recommits to a policy that teachers have to talk about, you have to grapple with these topics. So that becomes a part of it. I also want to take a moment and just acknowledge that I'm lucky. Like I'm fortunate that I am in this moment in time in Guilford and in Connecticut. And so I recognize that in Connecticut, we've got a state government and we've got a state Department of Education that is supportive and is still expecting us to do work around, right, the big, broad ideas of diversity and equity and inclusion. I get that DEI is now a third rail and people are afraid to touch it, but individually, the words diversity and equity and inclusion still have colloquial meaning, right? And that meaning is positive and important. And so we haven't shied away. We still have DEI information that is made available on our website. Not to suggest that we are indoctrinating our students into any political belief, but we believe that a diverse community is a rich community. We believe that our teaching team here should at least reflect the diversity of the state of Connecticut. Now, that's a goal we haven't achieved, but it's a positive goal, and I'm not ashamed to say we're still working towards that.
Sure, some things will remain aspirational as long as they're not, you're still moving in that direction or attempting to.
And so that all becomes really important for us. And at time, we have really worked to engage the community in conversations. And so we shared Hassan Jeffrey's TED Talk about the ideas of hard history, right? How do you hold two really conflicting ideas in your head at the same time? How do you acknowledge that James Madison is the brilliant intellect behind the First Amendment, right? He held children in slavery. It's the and that is difficult. And that is and now that goes to the qualities of being adaptable learners and critical thinkers. How do we encourage our students to be able to hold those contradictory ideas in their head?
And not to excuse, but to seek to understand, I guess.
Exactly right. And not to either demonize or whitewash. You have to recognize that's a historical figure in a moment in time, and we have to sit with the cognitive dissonance today of those two conflicting realities. Doesn't mean you pick a side. It means that you wrestle with those complexities.
Sure. And you hope that it informs future practice. So then you say, okay, so that's where we were, this is where we are, and where are we going? And many of us around the nation, particularly I was in the Midwest, but I was really in somewhat of a southern state. And that's not to indict southern states to say anything other than it was a very conservative state. I was in a university town within that. So sometimes we were calling it a blueberry and watermelon soup. But it was... And yet you still were getting some pushback about don't demonize the past. We've got to be proud. And we're like, oh, I'm proud of so many things. There are certain things that we should be ashamed of. And then what can we do about that? So what are the practices we're having? And if I can, I want to follow up with this question when I say that is that one of the things that we did as a school district is we required all 3,000 employees to engage in equity training. And this wasn't about making anyone feel guilty about anything other than to just recognize how every one of us has been socialized. We've been socialized differently. And so that way, that informs the way our beliefs and our principles and our values, and that absolutely influences the way that we make decisions or the systems we construct. And so that was a very intentional sort of work that we were doing. I did have someone call 911 saying that I made their spouse feel guilty for being white. And literally that happened where the 911 operator said, I'm sorry, what happened? My wife has been made to feel guilty for being white. And they're like, oh, this is 911. Yeah, this is an emergency. Sir, I'm hanging up. I mean, that's kind of ridiculousness. So I'm curious, what are some of the work that you and your colleagues, because I know this is not just individually just Paul Freeman. This is the board leading, right. This is you leading, this is your team leading, your community embracing. But how do you support educators in navigating these really complex conversations?
So we've done some really intentional and structured work and thoughtful work. And you're exactly right. Like while we do not go back in time and judge historical figures, right? We carry the dissonance in our head. While we do not attempt to make anybody today feel guilty about decisions that were made in the past, we also have to avoid falling into the trap of false neutrality. We're also not going to say that slavery was okay because it happened a long time ago.
Totally agree.
I mean, the story of the Texas educator who said we're going to teach both sides of the Holocaust, right, and got pilloried for it, I can empathize. Like, I understand the box that person felt she was in and that she was what she was trying to articulate, because we get sucked into this myth of false neutrality.
Totally.
Right?
So as a Jewish superintendent, I was called to an elementary school to have a conversation with a kid from our congregation who in their 5th grade debate unit was like, I'm going to debate whether, and I go, I won't use his real name, so I'll just say, hey, Abraham, this is not a debate worthy topic. Like your dad said, it's okay for me to come tell you. There's no debate on this. There's no two sides of this.
So we acknowledge it, right? We acknowledge right and wrong. We acknowledge history. So the work that we've done in Guilford really has overtly followed sort of two parallel tracks. So we do work in district with one of our contract service providers, and we do overt professional learning. And we have over the years learned about topics like implicit bias. We have learned about topics like microaggressions. We talk about the importance of belonging in the classroom. Connecticut is really directing a focus towards creating more restorative environments and practices in schools, particularly around the discipline process. And so that dovetails perfectly. And how do we create? We've talked instructionally about creating culturally responsive classrooms. You mentioned that we did, right? We've done material and text audits. So all of that is really important. We want to ensure that all of our students know that they belong in our schools and that they see themselves reflected in materials that we use, in authors that we select. Now, that doesn't mean that we wipe out the canon. We don't. But we also don't exclusively teach the canon. We don't just have to read dead white guys. We can read other sources as well. And then what has been really helpful, I think, and really important to the work is a partnership that we've done with a group out of Harvard. The ed ethics team out of Harvard has created a series of different case study protocols, and they all center around questions of ethical dilemmas, right? And so at times there are questions about diversity and equity, and at times there aren't, but they all center educators who are facing a moral dilemma. And they define dilemma by saying where there's no clear answer. I actually, at least in my practice, I often find that a dilemma is when there are two right answers, but they're mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. It's like sort of the difference between complicated and complex, right? I mean,
Yes.
It's like complicated is like, no, we'll figure it out. There's an answer, but complex, there's no great answer, or there are two answers that are often like diametrically opposed.
Exactly. And both is right, depending on whose perspective.
On the
you're
context,
taking.
yeah.
And then you only get to find one path forward. And so what the work with Harvard has afforded for us is the idea of deliberate practice in really safe environments. By fictionalizing these case studies, teachers can jump into cases that feel familiar without being so immediately, right? They're not real. And so they're not connecting as personally. My favorite comment at the end of and we've been working in these models with this team for, I think we're going into our third or fourth year. At the end of the year, we're getting feedback from teachers. I think we asked one of the focus groups which cases they engaged with. And the teacher said, I don't really remember which ones we did. I remember how they made me feel, and I remember they felt authentic. Teachers almost never get the chance for deliberative practice. You don't get to practice.
You think superintendents do either? I mean, this is kind of the reason why we're having these kinds of conversations, because often we're just like making decisions. We go, that was a good decision or a bad decision, but then we move on.
If I had been able to be an NFL player, I'd practice 6 days a week, and you only have to perform on Sundays, right? Everything else is practice. Teachers, us, right? Educators, it's the opposite. You're on every day, and you have people's real life kids in front of you every single day. The case study protocol allows us to practice the things that we talk about in ways that are really safe. And so those two together, and every time that we've done overt learning on topics like bias or microaggression, we get FOIs, right? And so I know that when those materials are put together, they're going to be FOI'd. We're going to provide them to the community. We know that's out there, but that's not a reason to avoid doing it. I quote Timothy Snyder a lot really lately. I've talked with the Board of Ed, and again, I know how fortunate I am to be doing this work in Connecticut at this moment in time. But we will not comply in advance. When there is intimidating or threatening language that's being floated around about staying away from DEI in schools, Connecticut's been really thoughtful about looking at that and telling us there's nothing that said we can't work to make sure that all of our children know they belong in our schools. There's nothing that's been said that says it's now illegal to teach things that have been written by people other than dead white guys, right? We're going to keep doing that work. We're going to continue to talk about the importance of belonging on our website until we're told it's illegal to do so. We're not going to start cleaning up that language and sanitizing everything we do preventatively because we know there's a bad feel to it at this time.
Well, it sounds, so that in this case, Connecticut has struck a nice balance of respecting local control while also taking leadership at a state level to say, we're going to back our school districts who take these types of actions. And that's not always the case. And you've made that abundantly clear. I wish that were the case everywhere around the nation. I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the show. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
I really thought it was funny that one of the first ever podcast invitations I got was to be on The Imperfect Leader. It just feels like the right fit for me.
That's right. You've made it. That's hilarious.
Yes. We're all imperfect, right? Everybody is a work in progress. And over time, I have started talking to our team locally. And I think I really started to lean into it during the pandemic. But I started talking to our leadership team about the idea of confident vulnerability, right? In this moment, we can't pretend to know the things that we don't know. And yet, the community also needs us to project an air of confidence. And in fact, it takes a real level of confidence for a leader to be able to stand up in front of the community and name the things that you don't know. The idea is not new. A lot of it came from Edgar Schein's work on humble inquiry, right? I've always known that even as a building administrator, right, I was at my best when I was observing teachers who didn't teach English language arts, right? The subject area where I held my teaching certificate, that was the one where I was most likely to go in and say, why aren't you doing that the way I would have done it? But man, when I walk into a music classroom or a really high-level science classroom, I'm asking questions out of genuine curiosity, and I'm willing to acknowledge right out of the gate, I'm not a musician or I'm not a science expert. Why did you choose to do this today? And the best instructional conversations I ever had with teachers came from that place. So then how do you leverage that as a superintendent? How do you take advantage of that same confident vulnerability that I'm willing? So I'm going to engage with it. We changed an offensive Native American mascot here in the town of Guilford a handful of years ago now, just in the early days of the pandemic. How do I go in front of the community and be willing to say, when did we make the decision to adopt this? When did we become this? I learned from being curious about it that Guilford had been a school district for 140 years. We had only had an offensive Native American mascot for 70 of those. It really wasn't part of our foundational identity. But I had to put that out there. And again, just to sort of be fair, I know that I've got colleagues. It is easier for me to foreground that idea of vulnerability as a 6-foot-something gray-haired white man than it would be for a leader of color or a female leader. I know that. But for me, it is naming that imperfection. It's naming those vulnerabilities that I actually think allows me to be a more effective leader. So that I'd love to go back. I say all the time, I'd love to go back and be a teacher again. I'd be a different teacher than I was when I was in the classroom. I'd be a different principal than I was. If I could reset the superintendent clock, having all the lessons that I have now after I'm going on 16 years as a superintendent, I'd be a different first, second, third, and fourth year superintendent now because of that learning cycle. I love the title. I think it's a perfectly titled podcast.
And we'll be right back.
This is Greg Meyer, Jamie's partner at APC Leadership Collaborative. When you hear Jamie here on an Imperfect Leader podcast, I hope you pick up on what a skillful listener he is, and that he has a knack for asking hard, revealing questions. Those are skills that we try to employ with every leader we support in our work. As coaches, we ask questions that help you work out your own path forward, no matter how complex the situation is. You shouldn't have to lead alone. You deserve a great partner. Contact APC Leadership Collaborative online at apccollab.com.
Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest today is Dr. Paul Freeman, Superintendent of Guilford Public Schools in Guilford, Connecticut. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they have made, or as I've now hearing, are still making. We'll talk about it and then we'll just discuss it. Paul, I guess what happened and what's happening?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the question, and I'm really happy to lean into the discussion. Generally, it was around 18 or 19 that we recognized as a school district. I really clearly recognized as a leader that at the time we were talking about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion in Guilford Public Schools, and we were addressing it as spectators, right? We were not taking the work seriously. We were not where other districts in the state were. Specifically, when George Floyd was killed, right, we began to hear in that moment in time from residents, from students, and most loudly, we started to hear from our graduates that we had missed something. We had Guilford High graduates who were coming back to us saying that we had prepared them in all ways to go out and engage in the broader world, except for one, that we had failed to prepare them to go out and engage in more diverse, more metropolitan, and specifically conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion in their world. This was a time before DEI had become a dirty word. And so we really began engaging in the work at that moment, more directly and more overtly. It was then that we addressed the Native American mascot. Now, I had been superintendent in this district for 10 years by that time. I had avoided and procrastinated that topic. Wasn't going to do so any longer, was going to tee that up and address it. It was then that we started to look at materials and book selections. It was then that we partnered with Dr. Seiler out of the University of St. Joseph and asked him to engage in empathy interviews with our students of color. Now, Guilford is a predominantly white community with a predominantly white school district. Our students of color represent a really small percentage of our student body. The data that we look at doesn't call out that we may have problems. We don't see disproportionality in placement in higher level courses or in discipline, but it's because the N is so small. When we sit down and talk to those students, we hear really clearly through anecdotal and qualitative data that their experience is different. So we began really wrestling with that conversation at that time. I thought our early moves were good, but I went in with an assumption that this work was an innate good. I think two things happened, right? I think nationally, there was all of a sudden pushback to doing this work. Chris Rufo, right, established a platform, and we began hearing attacks on critical race theory happening at the national level. At the same time, I was then shocked to find out that conversation was going to happen locally here in Guilford. I ignored the signals I was seeing at the national level because I was embracing an idea of not here. That's not the community that I'm working in. So I think the big mistake that I made was I fell into the not my kid trap that we fall into as parents. So this community that I'd been part of, I assumed that we didn't need to, right? I think the opportunity that I missed was to go back and publicly in a large way try to do some foundational work at the community level about why these conversations are going to be important. But we jumped in, I think, so enthusiastically that we got caught up in this national morass. And now...
Before we get to now, because I really want to ask, because I want to explore this, if it's all right, just to dig a little bit into the overlooked piece. Certainly post George Floyd, for us, it was post Michael Brown initially, because we were in Missouri and Ferguson's not too far from us, and knowing the superintendent there, and then and the president of the NAACP was in my community, and so she was leading a march from Ferguson down to Jefferson City, which is just down the road from us. And so there was a lot going on. The University of Missouri campus had protests and student encampment. So we sort of got a first look. We had student walkouts and things like that. And so we knew for us that we needed to begin doing similar type of work. And I hadn't even thought about, until you just mentioned it, what I could have done differently in terms of really priming the community for what these conversations were going to look like, and potentially the national attention that was going to be brought upon us, or even locally, if there's confusion because we didn't create clarity. And so what I think I hear you saying is like, the piece that got overlooked was these have been, for Guilford Public Schools and your board and so many of those who work and live within the system, your internal system, good, let's get this work going. Your external system may have been not fully prepared yet. And so that's where you were then dealing with having to clarify the work and the actions you were taking. Is that kind of what I hear?
Yeah. Yes. And it goes back to that. I think it goes back to that earlier sort of inherent contradiction that we were talking about. So we got caught in a moment in time that I saw as an opportunity to work on what we considered to be inherent goods. And at the same time, we then got caught in the second moment in time that was the pushback to that. It was right. And so I I never would have guessed that diversity, equity, inclusion would end up being things that people will boldly put on signs and say, these things don't belong in our schools. That's like saying happiness, joy, and fulfillment don't belong in our schools.
Or even just the sense of belonging, because if you shift the word inclusion to say belonging, which is what so many districts have done because they feel that they've been compelled to based on the lack of support at the state level and in the interpretation of certain executive orders and things like that. So they are, you know what? No one's going to argue about whether or not a child should feel as if they belong. So no one's going to argue. Anyway, it's astounding.
When we talk about, when we look at the Native American mascot as a micro example, I look at that one and I say we did well. Like, I recognized that people were going to be connected and invested to that name. And so we made space to hear those opinions. And at that time, I was in fact being criticized by those same graduates. Why are you making space to listen to racists? Was their push. My response was, I'm old enough and wise enough to know that everybody needs to be listened to. When we finally make this decision, I know that the community is going to be split, but I don't want anybody to be able to say I wasn't listened to. We managed that micro component differently than we managed the whole macro conversation, because in my mind, I didn't see the broader ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, social justice as having, right? And so again, I get caught into that contradiction between making space to honor and listen to everybody and not falling into the trap of a false neutrality. And so by seeing that one as more black and white than the name, I have contributed to now what becomes this protracted community conversation where there's a portion of our community that is really dug into the fact that we're now progressive, socialist, communist, and indoctrinating kids. That narrative hasn't gone away with time, and lacking a time machine, it's really difficult to engage with those community members now, because both they and the district, and right, including myself, have carved out our positions so solidly now.
Right. I was going to say almost to the point of fossilize for some. And what may have been an earlier conversation that could have been done respectfully in the way that Margaret Wheatley talks about leaning into that discomfort now has sort of morphed into almost a hate speech. And you're like, I'm not going to remain neutral on what may be coming out of your mouth that maybe 2 years ago would have been different. I hate to, it's almost saying radicalized, but fossilized maybe seems a little bit better in that they're just stuck.
And how do we engage with those folks who have now added what they think are really malicious motivations to our decisions, right? So it gets to a point that how do you now bring these two groups to the table and so if you're asking me,
I was going to ask you, how have you tried to do that even now? Because I sense you're one that doesn't give up. You're still going to try to engage people, even though it's almost knocking your head against the wall.
Well, and I hate to acknowledge it, but I'm going back to really early change theory where I'm saying to myself, you know what? They're different, right? There's the group of this community that's going to agree with the work that I'm doing. There's the group that's going to disagree. And and you can't worry about that calcified, resistant component. So I don't ever want to suggest that I've given up on anybody. I will come back to the table. And recently in public, I was asked during this year's budget process.
Which, by the way, Connecticut's budget process is bananas. All right, keep going. You don't have to agree or disagree, but there's no other state where it's like your board approves, and you go to the city, one part of the city government, then another part of the city government, then it comes back to the board. That's
every year we need to pass through the Board of Education, the Board of Finance, and then the town at referendum. And during that process this year, I was asked publicly, would I commit to removing all monies from this budget that are in any way aligned with efforts towards diversity, equity, inclusion, or they then added social emotional learning. And so I said, no, I simply am not going to do that. But It feels to me like, and I went to that individual after the meeting ended and I said, look, I don't think that you understand what you're asking. If you would like to come into my office, I will sit with you and I will talk with you about what diversity, equity, inclusion, and social emotional learning in our schools mean. So I'm going to keep offering that. But when you ask me to be really critical about a decision made in a moment in time that I would have done differently, I think I missed an opportunity to be more inclusive. And I think it's more difficult. And again, right, with just the speed that the national conversation is running away with this, I think I have missed a moment in time to get a bigger middle on this conversation and reduce the size of the calcified resistance. I think that there is a larger calcified resistance in Guilford, which is still a minority, right? The parent community, most of the community supports the work in the schools. But that now is a bigger anchor around the work than I think it could have been. And I'm not going to take responsibility for the whole national conversation happening, but I'm part of this local conversation. And
Right.
I allowed our local conversation to get caught up in a way that I could have done better at a different moment in time.
In the end, what would you say is something that's good that has come out of this entire experience? And it's ongoing. I get it. So
we're still living this every day. But I do think that when you think about how, as a superintendent, it feels like it's harder to model for students on a daily basis than when you're a classroom teacher or a principal. So I do believe that as a district, the board of ed members and the executive leadership team here, we have been given an opportunity to model for our students how we will make difficult situations, how we will continue to engage in really difficult conversations, and do that really when it's got a personal and professional cost in a really charged, polarized, politicized environment. And so I think we're still doing good work for kids. I think
Can I also propose what I think I've heard you say, although you haven't explicitly stated it, which is that as students were giving you feedback, your graduates who said, here are the things where I feel like the district fell short, not assigning it to any one person, but as a system, that there were intentional decisions made to remedy that. So everything from the audits to the continued training to the scenario building to the ed ethics work and all those types of things. I also got a sense, although you didn't say this, and maybe because what's on my mind right now is a conversation I had recently with Laura Chavez Moreno, who's a professor at UCLA, who talks about the racialization in schools. And she says one of the learnings that she's trying to help schools think about is instead of embedding a lot of this work at the high schools, but rather really looking at creating a scope and sequence at elementary that may be in these early years of pride around diversity, equity, inclusion, and then the upper elementary actually having maybe some projects around their own identities, and then middle school having maybe embedding in their coursework, and then having in the high schools elective classes around Black studies or Chicano studies, or just having specialized classes that kids can take while also weaving it into the general education. And anyway, it's kind of interesting to me. And I get a sense that maybe your own curriculum instruction team has been sort of thinking about really making this an introduction, weaving it through the entire system so that when graduates do leave, they are that empathetic learner that you're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, I think yes. And I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think at times I minimize the actual practical improvements that we've made.
Yeah, it's a lot of work because you said we're not just going to read dead white guys. Okay, but there were intentional decisions throughout the whole team the whole time.
Yeah, and I do appreciate you naming that, right? I think we have worked to improve the environment here. We really want to be a community where every student knows that they belong and are able to engage in that conversation. It's not this vague feeling that they have. They're actually able to sort of name and talk about it. And we also really had to listen to those student voices, create that practical roadmap, and then stick to those decisions, even in the face of pushback and personal and political attack. There are a lot of superintendents who have had a lot more of that than I've had to deal with, but I have woken up to find signs on my front lawn attacking me and the work that I'm doing in the community. And, right, I think that in addition to doing the good work, I think that's an important message for our kids to see. I've still been in this district, right? This work has started in 19 and I'm still here today. I didn't pack up and fold and go to another district because of that. And again, I want to name how fortunate I am. That's not because of my inherent toughness. That's because of my Board of Education. That's because of the Guilford community.
The implicit but also explicit
and
support.
being in Connecticut, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I'm going to keep naming that.
This episode is also brought to you by the great state of Connecticut.
Or New England,
From the
right?
from the Berkshires to the coastline to we'll do the whole thing. Our guest today was Dr. Paul Freeman, Superintendent of Guilford Public Schools in Guilford, Connecticut. And truly, I mean, more than anything, I just want to thank you for your confident vulnerability and throughout this entire conversation. What a joy it was to spend time with you.
Peter, thank you. This was great. I really appreciate the invitation to talk with you today.
We are back. Okay, I know you get to hear from superintendents all the time, and I know that sometimes you're predisposed to think, oh, I know how this conversation is going to go. I'm curious. Did it challenge your sort of mental model of how it was going to go?
All right, yeah, let's take a meta. This is the quick meta moment from the
Yeah.
two hosts of An Imperfect Leader, the
Okay.
Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. As anybody who listens to the podcast more than once will see that there's a pattern in terms of Peter's interviews. He asks the same questions. There's a purpose to that, right? So that we can do some thinking in the same way and people can hear the different ways in which people respond. It's fantastic. Particularly, I am extremely partial to the answer to what makes you an imperfect leader, what is an imperfect leader to you, and to the after action review. Those are my two favorites. For the most part, folks who are nervous to be vulnerable in the podcast makes for a challenging interview. It doesn't mean that they're not vulnerable in other spaces. It just means in that moment, they weren't all that clear.
It's a totally different medium of leadership and conversation.
And we joked
all of
about
it.
this in the last episode where we were like, why wouldn't you want to be on a podcast? Look at Jamie and Peter who are like, we'd do a podcast about ourselves if we had to. Lord,
you don't know, when I say goodbye to you, see you next week, then I just continue on. I'm just in here just... It's like a ChatGPT post.
Still
like,
recording.
What a great idea. You're so innovative. How creative are you?
Oh, that's so funny. I think I do the same, but the editor is my wife.
She's like, cut it out. Enough.
Like,
all right,
it's
sorry
over.
to interrupt.
Yeah.
So you're saying,
so
typically
all I
there
was
are
saying
similarities.
is that, so there's a lot of episodes that I think there's definitely something to find in every episode we do, but there are a lot of episodes that sort of have a similar pattern or cadence. And I started listening, getting ready to do the interview and getting ready to have this conversation. I listened to the interview, and both times I started to listen, I was like, oh, I know the cadence of this interview. I know where this is going. And then Paul came, and wow, I loved it. I thought Paul was spectacular in his reflections. He was I wrote down, in fact, I want to read the note I wrote. That basically just says, Dr. Freeman may be one of the best superintendents to describe the tangible work of a portrait of a graduate. I thought it was wonderful. Very clear, big, broad ideas, right? The tenets are big and broad. And here's how you do it. Here's the way that we connect it from elementary up to AP. I think he even says up to AP Chem or whatever it is. And that's exactly what you and I talk about all the time of, the alignment. It's clear that what
he has it. I would say in the Guilford Public Schools, and he's so careful and appropriate to say, he is lucky to be able to work in a community and with a board that is equally committed to this work. When we talk about superintendents making sure that there's alignment in their values and in the values of the community for which they're going to serve, and sometimes we accept jobs because it's the job. Oh, we're so excited. Here, he absolutely is in the job that aligns with the community's values. So that's really cool. And then I would take it one step further, which is in the portrait of a graduate work. I think we say, gosh, we want to prepare kids for an ever-changing world, or we want them to be critical thinkers, or whatever it is. We say, here's sort of he's saying, and this is how you do it. You actually have them grapple with concepts that are somewhat controversial. And to me, it was like, there's a specificity to what he wants kids to be able to do so that they can be productive neighbors, citizens of the world. And I just was like, this guy's great.
It requires putting in front of the students topics and content discussions that are worthy. Nobody is going to think deeply and struggle with a concept if it's not deep, rich, valuable, worthy concept. That's So good. And even how we open today, when we talk about that, you want to deepen worthy concept, let's talk about healthcare. Let's talk about how healthcare impacts you on a daily basis. How does it impact your family and beyond, your extended family? How about your friends? How about people in your community? And you can keep expanding the circle so that you have these deep and rich conversations. That's it. And how do you get better at having those hard conversations and deep and rich conversations? Have kids practice.
Yes. Do it over and over in a place where you can make a mistake, where you can change your mind, where you can change your mind again, based on new information. Yeah. I mean, he said it's something along like believing that avoiding discomfort will make deep learning possible. No, it makes it impossible. If you want deep learning, then engage in deep conversation on pertinent and deep topics. Done.
To me, that goes hand in hand with what he also says early in the interview about pedagogy, that he says that we want our kids thinking, that we wanted to figure out what the difference is between compliance and engagement. How do we know that the students are actually thinking? How do we make that thinking visible? And so what are the teacher moves that you can employ that let you see inside the head and behind the eyes for a moment in time and get a sense of what they're really grappling with? This comment, he says, what are the teacher moves? What task design and what instructional strategies are going to help us to center the visible learning thinking in everything that we do? That's my language. That's the thing.
Yeah. In fact, I want to go to APC, your company, and think about, so we want all those things for kids. Yeah. Let me ask you a question. You can't do that unless teachers, educators are prepared to facilitate those conversations.
Correct.
So what are some of the things that you do, or what's one way that you create that fertile field that allows for kids to explore their thinking in a safe way that is facilitated by a master teacher?
I want to answer this question this way, and then I would love your feedback on it. This is really an interesting idea, in that we have an instructional framework that we use. Obviously, we're ready and willing to support anybody with it, whatever instructional framework that they're using currently, because there's multiple. There's a bunch of different ways in which to talk about instruction. So we just happen to use one. And the one that we use looks at the easiest, I'm going to use Paul's language here. The easiest example of what he describes as a teacher move and task design is probably what I would call this. And that is, the more the people doing the talking are the people doing the learning. So therefore, students need to be talking to other students about the learning more often than teachers are talking to students about the learning. You do that, and kids will take up more. In fact, their data show, the instructional framework that we use, show that kids talking to kids about the learning, even when that conversation doesn't stay directly on the learning the whole time. Why? Because he's 12. That's why. It's still better than the teacher talking to the students about the learning. Does it mean the teacher doesn't have a place? No. The teacher has to create the space and ask the right questions that causes for the students to work together and wrestle with a particular idea. They then have to move through the room in order to listen to the students who are having trouble staying on topic or getting to the question that's being asked. So it requires a level of listening and facilitation beyond what I think most teachers do. Most teachers are asking a question of students. Then they say, go ahead and turn to your partner, talk about it. Okay, time's up. Tell me what you think. This is different than that. This is different. And that's usually where we start with, because it's the easiest. You can measure how long kids talk versus how long you talk. And that's a simple way, pedagogically. The content that you put in that will make it easier for them to talk to each other. So in other words, if you give them a meaty piece of content, it's a lot easier. If you ask them to finish the math problem, less easy.
Today, I had a coaching session with a client, and I showed the Ernesto Ceroli video. I've cut it down a bit, but I used it and I gave you credit. And it was a meaty reflection of vulnerability for an individual who said, essentially, shut up and listen. And I asked her, how does this message, this story, resonate for you considering the committee work that you're leading right now? It was amazing conversation. So
I love it.
I agree with you about finding content that will serve as a vehicle, and whether if you're a school district that is an avid district, that there are some frameworks and protocols that you can use within your classroom, like a philosophical chairs or the inside and outside circles and listening circles and things like that really begin to force dialogue with multiple perspectives and then always reaching back. And so can you share with me how you came to that conclusion, where the evidence in the text or evidence from your experience or whatever it is, it enriches beyond just the think, pair, share that you were describing?
Assuming that they do at the very least, think, pair, share at the very least.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, really, how many schools, and I imagine we all have entered classrooms where it's just sage on the stage lecture where there is one answer. So turn to your partner and come back to me, and there's one right answer. Yes. Yeah. Very good. Now I valued what you just said based on what I have told you is right. Let's move on.
I love that. I love when I see that in teachers. I will definitely put myself in the same boat of someone who's done this multiple times, who did this multiple times. And that is that you have the kids talk, you have the student talking, and you say, okay, let's hear what you have to say. No, that's close. No. Yeah, I see where you're thinking.
That's right.
No. Right. There it is. That's the answer. And so the guess what's on my mind game is a complete and utter waste of time, where you spend more time telling them what they did wrong and didn't get right or didn't and all you asked them was to think about this idea.
I really have to practice a lot more wait time, because kids are like, no, I'm not telling you what I've done, because I don't want your value statement of not quite. Yep. No, I like your thinking. You're on the right path. Who'd like to help him?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. Let's do this. Let's talk about his after action review in the remaining time that we have. Sure. And if you won't remember Andrew Dolph in Maine, because he was one of the first seasons, in his school district, they made a decision to change the mascot. So when I heard Paul talk about for 10 years, he didn't change the mascot, and then was thrust into that decision based on national circumstances. He talked about George Floyd. I referenced Michael Brown at one point. And so there was a national conversation, and they responded as a community. And it really made me think about Andrew's experience as well. What I thought was interesting about this after action review was the value and the understanding of incorporating, or maybe incorporating is not the right word, valuing the voice of anyone who wanted to come and provide feedback or input about this decision. Because if you don't do that, you have to weather the accusations that a decision has already been made. Even if you know that this is the way you have to go, it's really important to allow individuals in your community to at least give their thoughts. We had a similar situation with the renaming of Robert E. Lee Elementary School. Was there any question that the board was going to rename Robert E. Lee Elementary School? No. Did I also sit on it for a while? Yeah. Did I take advantage of the time being right to change it? And we still spent time at our board meeting listening to community members who would say, don't erase our history. If we want to study Robert E. Lee, we should do that and be able to keep the name of the school as a way to understand our past. And I think it was a valuable sort of thinking to allow anyone to provide their feedback. And the board then voted 7-0 to change it, but I could empathize with the decision to allow and to be, he at some point talks about confident vulnerability. I'm not sure if that was an example of it, but it certainly was, a willingness to entertain those conversations.
I love the comparison. It's such an interesting way to talk about it. But this is Jamie's brain. So please take this, listeners, please take this as Jamie's opinion, which is worth the same amount as a thing you might throw as a piece of paper.
I think it's super important. It's just why we do the sort of conversation afterwards, to be a thought partner for those who are driving. So what's on your mind?
You're the most sweet. You're sweet. Here's what I think. I think that there's a clear difference between the naming of a school, a place that people are going for that is intended for learning, that is intended for understanding the world and each other, versus a mascot. A mascot wears a costume, and it is not the same as the name of a school. And so in my mind, if the mascot causes for specific hurt of anybody that would be associated with a mascot. Why would you want to keep it? Does tradition is tradition more important than how that person feels?
Yeah, I'm curious how, until you've gone through it, and I don't mean that to be like, you don't know because you didn't go through it. People are pretty passionate about their mascots, and that surprised me. Whether you hear of the Raiders or the Redskins or whoa. And you're like, this seems pretty obvious that we need to move on. And they're like, no way. I played on that football team. I was a Raider. Now what am I?
But the question still stands. That's the question to be posed. I mean, this isn't, yes, I haven't gone through it, so it's a lot easier for me to pose this question. And that is, so are you telling me that you're okay with the fact that the name actively injures this percentage of people who go to the school currently? And if you can say, yep, I like the fact that they feel badly about it, that hurts them every day.
Yeah.
Then you've given me even more reason to change it, because you are actively saying that I want to hurt those people.
Interesting.
And so
how is that different from renaming the school? Like, why is that? Because I misunderstood. I thought you were saying like, it's just like renaming the school is a pretty big deal. Every kid crosses a threshold into that school. And
I guess I carry less. I guess in my mind, mascots carry less weight. Like, in fact, if I have my druthers, I would tell you that no school should be named after people that have passed. Why don't we name it so that the person who is currently living could come and visit the school? Wouldn't that be amazing? Why don't we name it after
they make terrible decisions sometimes, or something is revealed and then now you got to rename it. And I'll tell you, an example was we had a scoreboard named after an individual who was still living. And I think that litigation's ongoing, so I should probably stop now. But it was wild, the conversation I had with him on the phone. Here's what happened. And do we have a signed agreement? No? Okay. Did the board take action? Because they're the only ones who can name things. No? Huh. Okay.
And as you know, I'm pro for everybody getting to do what they think makes them feel better about themselves. Wonderful. Excellent. But it can't actually directly, negatively, you can't do it so that the person sitting next to you is hurt by it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think our universal connection to each other is that any disrespect, if it's harmful to the human spirit, then it's not okay. And and I don't know how you feel. I was, during my own equity work, was trained that there's no hierarchy of oppression, that oppression is oppression. And now, are individuals have potentially more opportunities? Yeah. If you're Black and you're a woman and you're of a socioeconomic class, like any one of those, you may have 3 opportunities to be oppressed as opposed to 1. And yet it's still destructive to the human spirit. And we had a healthy debate about that a lot.
That's what I usually describe as the oppression Olympics. People trying to show that they compete in more events.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
And it turns out, but actually any one event is hard to deal with. And so I don't play the oppression Olympics.
Amazing.
If you're open to talking about oppression.
It appears that you're a triathlete. I'm playing one sport.
You're throwing the discus. I get it. I get it.
That's the one sport you think I might be able to do. I can dizzy easily. Can I take Dramamine before I do it? Is that considered a performance-enhancing drug?
Oh, goodness. Sometimes when you say things, I'm like, that tracks. Get dizzy. Oh, my goodness gracious. That's hilarious. I think I loved his reflections here and how hard it was to have that conversation about the mascot. I understand the difficulty. I think the real after-action review here is in reflection of how should I have led this conversation differently, that it's not an easy one. That's the whole purpose of the global citizen. We're back to the graduation profile of a graduate. Yeah, even practice is going to be, it's better if you've had the practice to have the hard conversation, but if you don't practice at all, you know what you're going to be? Bad at having hard conversations. Guaranteed. This is part of the reason why when we partner with superintendents, you partner with a coach because you can practice before you go into the boardroom.
Yeah, there's nothing more valuable than the role playing. Yeah. So great.
So great. It is so great. It is so great.
I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Paul for his time. Truly, I know that the work was not easy. And while superintendents across the nation are facing national pressure and pushback and even personal attacks. And I remember Paul saying that he refused to comply in advance by a question that he got at the city level about their budget, about not doing any DEI. And he because of his relationship to his board and their commitment to the work, he was in a position to be able to say, no, I'm not going to comply in advance with any kind of directive like that. So he's lucky, and I know he knows it, and I think they're lucky to have him too. So
it's funny. My last comment is that as someone who, I'm from the West Coast, and I have spent time on the East Coast and have family and friends and other people out on the East Coast. But the comment from one of my family members about Connecticut is their primary comment about Connecticut is that it basically is a state that's always in the way. I'm either trying to get to Boston or go to New York, and for some reason Connecticut is still there. That's been the perception of Connecticut as I've grown up. And now Paul is one more reason for me to figure out why I should spend some time in Connecticut.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, I didn't want to interrupt you because I was I'm going to step on his line. But if they have always said that Connecticut is in the way, here was a great example of Connecticut leading the way.
Oh, look at you. You're like a commercial. No, that's not what I was going to say. What I was going to say is that I love the idea of how powerful Paul's work can be, how supportive Paul's board is to the work that they're doing, and his open honesty about what's possible because he's in Connecticut. It makes me rethink what I think Connecticut is, besides New Haven pizza, which I think is great.
Are you a Pepe's guy?
Oh, yeah. Aren't you? Who isn't?
All right. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Almansan.
We will see you next week. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.